Good morning or afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. We'll be starting in just a minute. Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. It's part of Contoral's Introduction to Information Governance 6-part course of study for the in-house practitioner. Over the last few weeks, we've touched upon a few different areas and components that make up an information governance program. We started with an introduction to information governance, sort of taking you through the basic steps of what it is, what you need to do, and what steps can you take to implement something in your organization. We then talked about a modern approach to records and information management. We talked about how we're seeing more electronic information out there being produced and the need for organizations to have modern and compliant records retention policies and schedules to be able to manage that information. And then in the third class, we talked about privacy and data classification standards, including being prepared for privacy legislation coming up, such as the California Consumer Privacy Act, and how to be compliant in time for those. And then in the last class, Achieving Litigation Readiness, we talked about how every company, obviously different in terms of size and litigation profile, but, there's many aspects that are similar in terms of being prepared for litigation. So that's what we covered in those classes. And so today, we are talking about implementing data placement and defensible disposition in your organization. And our speaker is Greg Forrest. Greg is CTO of Contoral. He has over 30 years of experience in compliance and information governance and implementing technical solutions, and is one of if you can call him a data placement expert, I would call him that. How are you, Greg? Welcome.
I'm doing just great. I wish I looked as young as my picture does.
Thanks, Greg. So, Greg, why don't you take us through what are some of the objectives of today's class? What will our attendees learn?
Well, what we're going to talk about today is data placement. And another way to say this is, what does a controlled life cycle for information look like? Where should I put things? How should I manage them? How should my employees interact with them? How do I share files? How do I store files? And at what level do I want to control things like privacy, security, retention, and disposition? So, the first thing we're going to talk about is what really is data placement and what's a data placement strategy. I'm going to talk a little bit about how to figure out what controls and what repositories make sense for your business, for your legal needs, for your litigation profile, for your regulatory environment. We'll talk about how putting those requirements together is kind of a necessity in order to really create an appropriate strategy and an appropriate approach. We'll talk a little bit about the 5-second rule, which basically is make it easy for employees, or they're going to figure out some way to circumvent the whole thing that you've designed. And of course, part of that is to make sure that whenever you're creating increased controls or new systems for people to work in, that you focus on employee productivity and collaboration as part of all that. And then finally, we'll talk about how good data placement actually will enhance your ability to meet privacy regulations and to accomplish security goals as well. So really the first question is, from an employee perspective, is there are all these different places that the company has provided. There may be structured applications. I've got my email. I've got file shares, both my own personal home directory share as well as group and secure shares out there. I've got my own workstation. I've got iPads and phones. I've got all kinds of cloud repositories like Box, and Google Docs, and all kinds of other places where I can store things. There's this document management system that's for records only that maybe I touch and maybe I don't. And then there's all the paper that I've got in my office, in file rooms, and offline. And the question is, where should any particular piece of content that I generate, receive, or pass along be put? And really, a lot of us have not spent the time to really look at the overall environment of how files and messages move around and figure out what should live where. So that's really the first part of a data placement strategy, is to kind of take a look at the high-level content types and say, all right, where should they go? Next. So the question is, how do we apply governance, right? So it's one thing to say, all right, email should live for short-term purposes inside an email server in my Outlook inbox, but long-term records should go out in a record management system somewhere. But it's another thing to look at what types of governance and controls do I need to put on each of the repositories in that life cycle, if you will. Obviously, I've got to worry about record retention, but not just record retention, also record retention and non-record information. So in other words, I might lock down my records really well and keep them for exactly the right number of years, but if everything else is there for forever, kind of doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Here I am controlling my records for a short period of time, but I'm letting the junk be there for 20 years. So it's more than just record retention, but certainly retention is a huge part of governance. Then I've got, intellectual property, I've got privacy, particularly with all the new regulations, and overall security for my information to avoid breaches and reputation risk and all kinds of other pieces. Now, I've got to worry about search. E-discovery used to be all about legal and regulatory and occasionally audit. But now e-discovery is about just privacy search. So if you look at GDPR, if you look at California protection, both of these require you to be able to actually show all the information you're storing about an individual. Well, what that means is now you've got potentially thousands of e-discovery cases, not the 10 or 20 or 100 that you're used to every year. So I've got to figure that out in this scenario as well. And most importantly, and never forget, that bottom right-hand quadrant is, I better make it easy for my employees to use, and I better enhance collaboration because, let's face it, they're used to social media now. They're used to communicating in a variety of different ways and to sharing information a lot of different ways. So when I apply my governance, I need to basically enable that in productivity and collaboration while still making sure the other three quadrants are covered. So the question is, what technology do I need? And this is a hard question, to be real honest. The playing field keeps changing rapidly, and there's been some very large changes in the way that certain players in the playing field have addressed things. So, the big elephant in the room is right up on top, that Office 365 box. Microsoft has basically now put every product and every capability into a single suite. So now I've got an email server, I've got a messaging server, I've got a video streaming server, I've got a records repository in SharePoint that's actually, with some of the new things that Microsoft's put in over the last 6 months, potentially better than anything else I can buy on the market. I've got a collaborative sharing tool in OneDrive. So how do I, decide whether should I just put all my apples in that one basket, or indeed, should I look at each of the individual capabilities I need and start looking at various players? And so, we have 5 or 6 different high-end document management systems on this list in the second tier there. All of those are really good, but they have strengths and weaknesses that may be appropriate for your company and not for another, that might be good for a medium or a small business and not necessarily for a very large business. So again, I've got to kind of take a look across that tier and say, well, what do I need? Then there are all the different players that scan and delete rot and tell me what I've got. There are tools that allow me to take information from certain types of applications and store those as individual files. So, there's a lot of different tools on here. How do I figure out what technology I need? And you don't start with that technology first, but at the same time, the capabilities of each of these systems are quite variable and do different things in different ways for different types of content and information. Some of them are better for financial transactions. Some of them are better for, pharma types of solutions or engineering type jobs. So, how do I pick what technology I need? What should I do to try to figure out how I should move forward? And we put this up right away. And the question is, if I don't make the process of classifying a piece of information for all those different governance needs, retention, privacy, intellectual property, security, access, if I don't make it easy for employees to figure out either where they can put it so it's automatically classified, or to make it easy for them to tag it quickly and easily, they'll figure out somewhere else to store data, right? I mean, I think one of the most common things that I see is that people will take their email system and lock it down to a very short period so that it automatically deletes email after 30 days, we'll say. And then we find out 2 years later after that policy goes in that there is email all over the environment in every single one of those places I showed on that first slide. It's living on their hard disk. It's living in their file shares. It's living in their group file shares. Some of it's been stored off on SharePoint and a bunch of it got stored off onto Box, right? So let's make sure that the content stays where it needs to stay by making it easy for employees. So here we are looking at, okay, I've got to put it somewhere. Got to figure out where each thing goes. And I also need all this technology to make that happen well. So as a company, now you've got a whole bunch of different groups, each that owns some piece of that pie, trying to solve the problem, right? So you get this large discussion, or sometimes no discussion. Sometimes each individual silo tries to solve it on their own. IT says, we've got to move to the cloud, so we're going to go with Office 365. But information management doesn't even know that that's happening until it's halfway down the road, and all of a sudden they're saying, well, how are we going to do retention and disposition out there? Who's going to make that choice? So one of the things that's really key to this whole exercise is that it is not an individual responsibility of legal, of IT, of records management, or even the business. Indeed, it has to be a corporate initiative for things to go clear. And all these questions are just the tip of the iceberg. I sit in all-day workshops trying to get to this kind of common understanding of even what the problem is. Even that's difficult. So, there's a need from an organizational perspective to really decide that you're going to do this for the organization as a whole. You may be leading it from one of those silos I described, but this is truly a corporate initiative. So before I decide how strategically I'm going to place my content and where it's going to go, there's a few things that need to be in order. And the first is really policies. So it's extremely important that your retention schedule is appropriate, that it is comprehensive and covers all the different record types that might live out in your environment. It also needs to be media agnostic. And what this means is that a lot of times we go in and look at retention schedules and it's all focused on the original paper issues that the company has, but the company's long since moved on and 90% of its data now is electronic. So, make sure your retention schedule doesn't say things like information in this system should be kept for this many days and this system should be kept in that many days, because you probably have 10 different record types in each of those systems. You need to be a little more granular than that. And also those record types may live in 5 different systems themselves. So there's a many-to-many kind of relationship between that. And the retention schedule is probably the guiding light to how you're going to do retention and disposition in a data placement scenario. You know, in terms of usage policies themselves, that starts to govern how your individual repositories can be used. So if the policies for those aren't clear, or if they're too restrictive and don't allow for the appropriate information to be stored there, those may have to be looked at. Like the retention schedule, when we're trying to decide what type of controls to put on information for access, for search, for sharing, for printing, that type of information, we need to have a security classification policy that pretty much defines, and we talked about in one of the previous webinars how that works, that defines what type of data people are working with. You know, do you have a feel for what's really out there? I mean, I think this is probably the most common thing that we discover is that a lot of companies really don't, from any given one of those silos I was talking about, have a good understanding of what's really being stored where and why. You know, IT may have a really good list of repositories, know exactly how big they are, how long they've been around, how they're backed up, but they may not know the content at all because that's quote unquote up to the business. So how do we kind of bring that understanding around? And part of that is doing an inventory in some cases, and part of that is doing, you know, kind of a overview look at what's stored in where. You know, I talked about the fact that this can't be an individual siloed activity. You've got to have the right guidance. You've got to have the right people involved in this. And that really means you can't leave out any of the people that are on this list down here. You know, all of them need to participate in one way, shape, or form, either through some kind of steering committee or an advisory board, or by actually holding workshops that are cross-functional across the company to really attack this problem as a whole. And most importantly, do you understand your business requirements? Do you know how people need to collaborate and share data? You know, a lot of times I go into companies and there's all kinds of duplicate information. And the reason why is that at some point in time, someone set up extremely tight security on certain areas, and yet the information in those areas needs to be used by 5 or 6 different business units. And so what happens is but 1 or 2 people from each business unit gets access to that area. They take the information out and then they start disseminating an email and all kinds of other different places, and you end up with 5 different copies, no 2 of which are alike. So, I mean, that gets to be a real issue. That's where the version control comes in. You know, do you need workflow? Is your business actually set up in such a way that, you know, each thing that gets done is a step-by-step process that's really well defined? You know, that means you need a different type of system than one that's more free-form. And is your workforce moving towards a more mobile type environment, right? Do you have a lot of at-home workers? Are you distributed all over the world? In which case it may be more appropriate to look at solutions that are better from that collaboration space, but that have very tight security that can be placed on individual documents. So again, before we start a strategy, we really need to know the environment in which we work. So we're talking about one small piece of a full information governance framework, and I'm not going to try to describe all of this. I'm just going to kind of try to describe where we're at. So, you know, there are a set of policies. We talked about those. There are a set of processes the company has already started or needs to put into place in order to be successful. Where a data placement as an exercise comes in is in the strategy scenario. So the first thing is to define where things should be and how that relates to things like how are we going to change employees' behavior to stop saving everything forever and instead save things for the right period of time? How are we going to organize and design this information and also the metadata about this information so that it can be easily managed? You know, those are all very important parts of a strategy. And without that strategy, you really can't move into that implementation phase of selecting things, configuring them, doing the training, doing the cleanup of the legacy data, and doing the migration of information into the systems that can handle the different controls and the different kinds of governance that we need. And if you get to the end of that point, then you're basically in an audit and remediation state where you kind of have to do an ongoing look at your strategy and your implementation of that strategy to make sure that you're still in compliance. So the way to think about this is that data placement is one part of an overall governance framework, but it's a very key part because you really shouldn't be moving to the right into implementation without first doing your data placement exercise. So I've said this in a couple of different ways, but I'll say it more forcefully now. The worst mistake that you can make is to pick a repository, and I've been in records management now for 25 plus years, and what I hear over and over again from my peers is we really have to get a records management system. We really need an enterprise content management system. We really need a document management system. And once we get that in, everything will be fine. And so there's this focus on that technology, even from people who should be business first. And if you pick that repository without understanding the environment, without looking at your policies, without putting all your requirements together, then what you're into the situation of is trying to push everything into that repository, even if it doesn't really belong. So I think it's good in a lot of cases to have your records in a single place, or at least controlled in a single pane of glass, but not always is that going to be just one system. Sometimes it will be multiple systems for different purposes. And the other piece that I think is less common, but there's this idea that once we bought that document management system or that enterprise content management system, now we need to create the perfect taxonomy that breaks down all the information in our company into very discrete categories and that has a whole bunch of different keywords for each and every one and lists of appropriate values that will handle it. I have seen companies in a 8 or 10-year taxonomy project who never get to the point of actually placing their data in a system and using metadata to do any kind of controls. Or who have built the perfect taxonomy and then have to actually create individual applications for each business unit to fit into that taxonomy in their enterprise content management system. That cost is extremely high. It takes a very long time to implement. You may get 3 or 4 groups through it, but you're never going to push the whole company through that needle. And so be careful on this perfect taxonomy. I am a big proponent of metadata at a minimal set for controlling information for retention, for security, for privacy. But if you try to get the absolute perfect taxonomy, it's going to take you forever and you're not going to really get the results. And the reality is that was very necessary for document management systems 5 or 10 years ago because they didn't have good full text search over the top to find things. And people weren't used to using search engines. So you had to have the perfect taxonomy so that people could put in 3 or 4 keywords and actually find something. Well, most engines today have very good search associated with them. All the different systems that are out there today have good search engines. And people are used to Google. They've been using it forever. So the idea is you may not need quite as much taxonomy to control your information as you used to because now people can do full text search. So I'm not saying that taxonomy isn't important. It is. Don't spend all your time trying to create the world's most perfect taxonomy because your business will change faster than you can put these things together. So when we talk about a data placement strategy, the employee view is extremely important. Again, I've talked about this a couple of times in a couple of different ways, but let's get into it a little bit deeper here. The first thing is it needs to be easy to put it somewhere, right? One of the biggest things that we find every time we go out and work with business units, interview people about their content, really try to get into what a particular company is doing in terms of the information it's storing, the first thing that people say to us is, we really aren't quite sure where we're supposed to put things. Certainly we know that our transactional information that we do belongs in the system that's designed for us, whether that be a financial system for accounting or a manufacturing system for the shop floor. That's pretty easy. But the reality is that we are an information-based society at this point. Everybody is creating Word documents, is communicating in all types of different messaging platforms, is creating spreadsheets to track financial information, even if they're a non-financial group. So the question is, where does that information that is not core transactions stored in an information system, where does it live? Where do I put that stuff? And frankly, most of us haven't spent the time to really define that well for individual employees. And so they put it wherever it's most convenient, where they did it the last place they worked, or where somebody told them to put it when they first came in, even if since then 3 new systems have been added that might make better choices in terms of where to go. So, it needs to be easy. I need to be able to put it there easily. And the locations that I have need to be well defined, and I really shouldn't have a whole bunch of choices. In other words, I should know anytime I get a specific document in email, or I create a new document from my desktop, or I scan some piece of paper in so that's electronic, I should know where it goes. It should be easy for me as an employee to figure out where that is. I shouldn't have a whole lot of choices. We find this in our own company. We're fairly small company comparative to most of the enterprises out there, but we keep looking at new technology, and so we keep adding new places to store things. Now, even within our own company, that can sometimes get confusing. So we've, really kind of focused ourselves in the last year to kind of say, all right, where does this specific piece of information goes? There's a difference between a collaborative project for an individual customer and the repository where we keep all our agreements and our statements of work and our master services agreements and our NDAs, right? Those should all be in a very known place and easy to get to, as opposed to a project that we're working on with a customer for 6 months. That's a different type of scenario. We need to have locations that are appropriate for each. Again, that 5-second rule, I'm going to hit that again over and over and over again. You cannot force someone to go make 6 choices every time they save a document. They might make 1 or 2 choices if those choices are tailored to them. You don't want people to have to pick from a list of 200 different record codes every time they store something. If I'm in finance, I should only see the 6 or 7 record codes that apply to my area if I'm going to allow that type of easy-to-use flexibility to have all kinds of different information in the same place. Then I need to have a few choices that I pick from in order to save that, a few content types. Or, even better, maybe up front my department has decided how things are going to be stored. They've created a set of folders, a set of libraries, a set of places where information can be stored that have names that make sense to me, and those automatically inherit a whole bunch of different properties associated with metadata. That's the best, because then it's less than a 5-second rule. It's truly a drag and drop to the right place, and I'm all done, right? All of that is necessary for an employee to be able to follow a control or a retention-based type of scenario. And finally, it should be easy, and it should enable productivity. And I think this is one of the pieces that a good data placement strategy can change. So in a lot of our companies, we have siloed file shares that are for a single department or a single group. It's sometimes difficult to get yourself into one of those areas. And if 3 or more departments, heaven forbid, actually collaborate on something, now you've got multiple copies in all 3 places being stored because only certain people could get to it. So one of the things that a good data placement strategy is to use some level of metadata and tagging to allow people in all 3 departments to see a single copy that lives in a known place and where edits can actually be made in place with multiple people in that one place. Now, this is what modern systems do, much better than a file share type environment, but you've got to build that productivity in when you go ahead and make it there. So again, for an employee, it's pretty simple. not too many places to put it, make it easy to put it there, and make sure that I can work with my fellow employees and sometimes with the outside world in a way that makes it simpler than what I'm doing today. I have a company that has a do no harm philosophy from an IT perspective. I don't think that goes far enough. If you're going to implement more controls, if you're going to implement modern systems, you also need to bring an advantage to the employee, whether that be a full text search across multiple repositories, or whether that be easier to share, whether that be heads up tags inside a document to tell them what they're working with so they know right away whether they're in policy adherence or not, whether that be locations that are custom built with metadata, so just by placing a file there, the metadata follows the file around inside the environment. So again, an employee view is make it easy. So that's the employee view, but that doesn't really get us to governance. That's the other side. That's the repository control view. And you know, there's a bunch of different ways to think about controls, but we kind of like to break them into, you know, just a few primary categories. The first being retention, and that's the blue on this slide. So is this information a working document that I need for my own personal use for a short period of time? In other words, is this my drafts, my convenience copies, you know, things that I'm working on that right now I'm doing all by myself. I might want to eventually share with other people, or I might want to eventually say this is a final business record, but for right now it's just kind of my working stuff, my scratch area, you know. Or is it indeed long-term reference, right? Did I find the perfect white paper out on the web that describes the activity I'm trying to do, that I'm kind of using as my guideline, and that I might need for a lot longer than just while I'm doing this one project, and might be interesting to my whole work group as a whole to kind of see what others in the industry are doing, or perhaps a reference information is something that I did once as a presentation that was extremely successful. So I want to keep that format and that flow available so that I can reuse it again. You know, reusable work products often go into this reference category. They're not necessarily records. They really aren't short-term working information. They're a point in the sand that I want to use over and over again. I'm going to need to retain that for a different period of time. One of the things about records is if everything was time-based, if the world was perfect and from the date it was created, we could keep it for exactly 5 years and get rid of it, then modern, difficult to set up and configure records management systems wouldn't be necessary. Unfortunately, for most of us, we have event-based records, employee files that we have to keep for some number of years after an employee leaves, or contract files that we have to keep for some number of years after we stop doing business with a vendor, or product files that we have to keep until a product has been no longer available on the market, plus some number of years. You know, regulations tend to be some event plus some number of years. That's difficult to manage from a retention perspective, and we need systems that are aware of event-based records in order to handle that. You know, certainly our high-end enterprise content management systems have had that capability for some period of time, but usually with a lot of manual intervention. Even Microsoft has now introduced event-based records retention over the last 6 months, and they've made it super simple so that mere mortals and humans can actually work with it. So again, you know, retention is one of the big controls that we need to worry about. The second piece is really privacy and sensitivity, and we have them grouped together for a reason. You know, a lot of us might think of, you know, PII, PHI, privacy information as something completely separate from, you know, this concept of confidential, restricted, internal use, public, etc. That more was originally developed for things like security and access, and for things like intellectual property. What most companies are coming to the understanding of is that from a control perspective, highly confidential intellectual property should be treated very much like privacy information in terms of the types of controls, the ability to share, the ability to encrypt when it goes outside of the environment, you know, those types of things. So what a lot of folks are doing now is kind of looking at that as a single set of control areas. And certainly, again, not to keep beating this horse, but in Office 365, Microsoft has done a lot of work to make their sensitivity area handle both privacy and intellectual property. So, again, when you're looking at controls, you kind of want to look at these as the same type of exercise. Even if there are different parts of your company that are managing these two pieces, the solution for implementing from a repository perspective may be exactly the same. If you've got a modern repository, it's going to have a high-end search. If it has a high-end search, that now means discovery is much easier. So if I tried to find all the personal information about Joe Smith inside a file share, the time it would take to do that and the amount of data that I'd have to go through would be intense, because there would be no index that I could quickly search to figure out whether his name had been mentioned anywhere. Whereas if I'm in a new modern system, an enterprise content management system, a document management system, Office 365, etc., what I've got now is a quick discovery engine that can tell me exactly what I need. All right, that can quickly go through an index and come up with 50 things in 4 different repositories that are associated with Joe Smith. So again, discovery gets much easier. And again, doesn't matter what type of discovery we're talking about, whether it's legal or whether it's regulatory or whether it's privacy-based, discovery is much quicker and possible in a repository. So again, it may be that you don't need high-end retention and privacy capabilities for a lot of your data. That does not mean you don't need discovery. So again, you need to look at that when you're trying to figure out what repository to put what kind of information in. And then we get to business value, right? So frankly, if the only thing that this information has to the business is that it's interesting to me as an individual, I could have that locally on my laptop and be perfectly fine with it, right? But if that piece of information actually is needed by my whole work group, or God forbid the entire company, and I've got it stored on my laptop, then I got a problem, right? Because now it's very difficult for someone else to get that information and that knowledge that I have in a way that's easy for them to find. So, again, when we look at repository controls, who needs to access and how wide do we need to disseminate that information becomes a very interesting point when looking at which piece of the repository puzzle to solve for which type of content. So, the second half of this chart really kind of starts to get into what that might look like. So if I look at, a working document scenario, right, I need it for a couple of years, maybe 3. It's got it's probably not super sensitive if it's something that's internal. It doesn't have a whole lot of relevance from an e-discovery perspective because it's not a final work product. It's not documenting a decision. But it's really interesting to me as an individual. So where do I put this? Well, I could put this in SharePoint. I might be putting this in a worst case on my desktop. I might be storing it in OneDrive. I might be storing it in Google Docs. It all depends on what my system has. But again, this is a highly available place for me to store my information. Now, finance records are something completely different, right? I know we have to keep these. We need a very locked down copy because we have to be able to prove exactly where our finances were X number of years ago. I need to make it fairly confidential because, financial information is not something we share with the outside world. From a discovery perspective, yeah, it actually might be something that needs to be discovered for one reason or another. And frankly, it's probably got value to multiple people in the organization, not just 1 or 2, but everyone in the finance group, the tax group, and the legal group may need to go back and look at finance records. So again, I want to put this into some kind of system, an ECM system, something that can do good records management and something that allows for controlled access to information. Reference information. So again, I don't think that most individuals need to keep things for long periods of time. And if they do, that information is probably valuable to the group as a whole. So in a lot of companies, institutional knowledge goes out the door when someone that's been there for a long time retires or hits the lottery. So shouldn't I be keeping long-term reference information in some type of group repository so that multiple people can get to it? And if that reference information is really necessary for business productivity, shouldn't I make it easy to get to from a perspective of on any device, anytime? So again, maybe that's got a little different scenario to it than a record type of area. And then finally, I may have a very specific application for certain types of information, contracts, legal matter management. There are certain pieces that make perfect sense to have in a standalone repository. So again, don't get too hung up on one repository for all records. It may make sense to have some point solutions. And I think in most enterprise business, you'll see 5 or 6 point solutions in addition to the standard ECM in the middle. Next slide, please. So, when I'm trying to figure out what are the requirements for an individual document that determine what place that document should go into, I look at search and access. So is this something that needs to be shared quite a bit, or is this something that needs to be locked down? Do I need to be able to find it quickly without having a whole lot of information? Is it something that needs to be collaborated on by multiple people? Obviously, retention and disposition is extremely important, not just for records. I'll hit this again. It's also about non-records, because if your record becomes a needle in a haystack because you have 15 years of junk surrounding, the little bit of record that you have in a particular repository, it gets much harder to find. If research results come back with 50 things, it's a lot different than it comes back with 3 or 4. So again, I need to be able to dispose of non-record content just as easily as I need to retain record content. Have I made legal hold and discovery easy, or is that going to be extremely difficult to find information in the repository? And finally, did I make sure that my security and my privacy classifications follow the document, are on the document, and that things are handled properly, whether they're being stored or whether they're moving around? So I need a data security classification to tell my encryption engine whether this can lead through the firewall, whether it can be placed in email, whether it can be shared in this particular cloud repository. So, all of these different key elements are part of deciding which documents need to be stored and available in which places. So here I am trying to figure out, all right, so what should an employee see? Right? What filing locations should any given employee have? And again, there's logos down here. It's just to give examples. Not necessarily these are the best or even the necessarily exactly the right places to put these things. But, kind of the idea is, where does an employee put information? They should know. Where do my personal working documents go? Where do my financial records or whatever records my department produces go? Where should information that tends to be shared across multiple areas like contracts go? Where is the reference information for my group, right? Those all should be very well known to the employee, and really there should be areas set up by names that the employee is comfortable with in each of these types of systems, so that it's very easy for them to store what they need in the right place, and that based on that, it gets the appropriate retention. So when we talk about defensible deletion, let's talk about email. It's a good one because it's something where we get all different types of content coming in. We might get something from a vendor that we do business with or an outside third party that is absolutely a record, and we might be the person in the company that record comes to. We might get information that is completely transitory. Hey, do you want to have lunch today? We might get information that is decisions that are records, but they're records that are internal. Your boss saying, yeah, go ahead and take that trip. Go ahead and go to that seminar. Right? That's a decision. That's a record that needs to be stored someplace because they've just given you authorization. It might be reference information. You might belong to a user group for a certain part of business that you're responsible for, and you might get a piece of information coming in that is very valuable, not just to you, but to all the people that you work with. So how do I take that information as it flows to me as an individual in my Outlook mailbox or my Gmail box and put it in the right place, right? How do I make that classification happen? And what system does it belong in? And so, a defensible deletion says, if I don't classify it at all, it's probably that transitory do you want to go to lunch information, or it's something that came from my user group that I don't really care about, or it's a bunch of spam, or whatever it may be. Frankly, I want to know that if I don't do any kind of classification with it, that my mailbox won't end up with 30,000 items in it. So, one of the ways to set up automatic deletion would be to say, all right, if someone hasn't tagged it, if they haven't moved it into another repository, let's go ahead and automatically delete it off the end. Right, I know this scares a lot of people, but I got to tell you, a self-cleaning mailbox is a wonderful thing because it keeps the body count down and you feel like you can manage it pretty well. But now, if I need to actually save my records in a record place, and a lot of times an email or an attachment that we get through our email it isn't really interesting on its own. It needs to be stored with all the records that are being produced or out of systems or spreadsheets that talk about those records in that central location. So maybe I've got an integration to a document management system like OnBase in this case. And so it's very easy for me to drag and drop into my record areas inside that system from directly inside inside my document repository inside Outlook. But maybe my working documents, now in this case, we're actually talking about, all right, if I've got a file that I know I'm going to have to work on that somebody sent me, but it's not really the final, and it's something that I need to work on my own, maybe I put that someplace else. In this case, we've got Dropbox for Business, but a lot of people actually keep working documents right in their Outlook mailbox. But again, put a retention period on those so that they only stick around for so long. Because frankly, you're not going to work on a document for 5 years. You're going to work on it for a little while, usually 6 months, a year, 2 years at the outside, maybe 3 years. I do see people put 3-year policies on there. So that might be a place where working documents go. And again, reference information. Maybe it's best for me to put it out on a team site or put it into SharePoint. Or to put it in some other type of collaborative system that my group uses as their knowledge base. And I do see some people even taking information and putting them in mailboxes associated with team sites so that their whole group can see important emails. And it's no longer locked in my individual email box so that when I leave, it's just disappeared. So again, this is kind of an idea of defensible deletion because I'm putting the information in places where it will be retained for the right period of time, and then I'm getting rid of what an employee doesn't care about on an automated basis. So I think a lot of us who have been doing records management for a long time think about records management as a control, right? And it's really not that you can't. It's really from a change management perspective that you've got to sell, you can. So if we start using this repository that has full text search and a really nice engine to go find things, that's a much better situation than a file share where I can never find anything, right? If we provide some type of organizational structure and known places where things can be kept, and at a department level define what our filing structure will look like, then it's much easier to do my work because it's organized the way that I do my job, right? It's easier to share valuable content, right, if I do this correctly. I can always find the most current version. I think, one of the things that a lot of people clamor for is, hey, I want version control. I want to know whether the document that I'm looking at was the final or something 4 revs back. If I'm involved in creating a final document, I want to see what changes were made by other people since the last time I looked at it. And in some cases, I want to get on some kind of interactive portal and work with 3 other people managing and changing a document at the same time. That's something we do internally all the time. That is a win for an employee. It is more productive. It's a you can, not a you can't, right? I don't want to have to worry about going through and cleaning up stuff every so often because I know it's not supposed to be kept anymore. I, as an employee, don't want to worry about a record retention schedule. I want to worry about where things are put and how it's classified, and then I want the system to take care of it for me, right? I want to know that I can use my mobile device. If I put things in the right system, then I will have the right controls so that I can use my iPad to access certain information, right? I know that it's secure. I know if I lose it, my company can wipe that information before somebody gets access to it. That needle in the haystack thing is a big deal. For most of you that have been in the same job for 10 or 15 years, working in the same set of file shares, I defy you to find things super quickly in that file share unless it's been well organized and unless some kind of cleanup and exercise and retention exercises is going on. Because, when you go into a folder and there's 2,000 documents and you're trying to find one, that can be difficult. And then finally, I want to not worry about if I lose my laptop, did I lose valuable information? It should be up in repositories so that if I lose my laptop, I just get a new one and reconnect and there's all my data, right? I don't want to worry about, did I just expose my company to a huge breach because I have a worksheet on my laptop that contains every single customer ID that we have and therefore is considered a privacy issue. So again, move away from you can't do this to you really can do this if we do it right. So what should you come out of this class with? First off, data placement is about which repository is the best for which content and what controls are necessary in that repository. I want to make sure that I don't look at this problem from just one perspective. A lot of companies will throw a ton of money at information security because they're scared to death of a breach, a privacy issue, or one of the regulations that's come out and completely forget about the retention side of it, which just keeps making the problem worse and worse because more and more files are being stored. 5-second rule. Keep that in mind. Do not ever design an interface that takes more than 5 seconds for an employee to classify, make a decision, and store a piece of document. If you do, you're done. Remember that, a good data placement strategy defines where certain kinds of information should live and makes it easy for an employee to store into those few places. And that if you are going to have your employees involved in the classification process, that they're not choosing from the set of classifications for a whole company, but just the ones that make sense to their department. And then finally, data security, access control, records retention should be automated within the repository, not necessarily placed on top of the employee. The employee should worry about where to put it. The repository should figure out what to do with it from there. I think these are the most important points to kind of keep in mind when you're trying to put a data placement strategy together. Carlos, you going to take it from here?
Yes, sir. Thanks, Greg. Very much appreciate that insight. We're now going into the question and answer portion of the webinar. So if you have any questions, feel free to type those in and we will answer those, or Greg will answer those as we get them in. In the meantime, if you've attended our other webinars, you might know a little bit about Contourl, but if you haven't, we are the largest independent provider of records and information management services, litigation readiness, control of sensitive information, otherwise known as information governance. So we're independent. We don't sell any products. We don't take any referral fees. We are experienced. We've worked with more than 30% of the Fortune 500, a number of federal agencies, mid-sized companies, nonprofit organizations, and our consultants average more than 23 years of experience in their respective fields. So we have former CIOs, former CEOs, privacy professionals, litigators, records managers, a lot of experienced folks on our staff. And if you haven't done so yet, our complimentary white paper is still available, Creating a California Consumer Privacy Act Action Plan. What you need to do. This is a two-part white paper, sort of providing an overview of what the CCPA is, and part two, what it is that you need to do and what action plan could you follow to make sure your company is compliant. So if you are interested in this white paper, feel free to send us an email, info@contoral.com, and I'll go ahead and send that your way. And like I mentioned at the beginning, this is part 5 of a 6-part course. Our final class will be on December 13th, taking a little bit of a break before our final class for the holidays. December 13th, Driving Employee Behavior Change Management. I think Greg brought up a good point throughout the webinar, and that is that you want to make sure that your employees are engaged and that you're making it easy for your employees to follow your program and make sure they're placing their data and information in the right place. And so what this webinar will cover are some of the challenges that we've seen organizations and getting employees to follow their programs and what you can do to overcome those challenges. And finally, if you could please complete the survey as you exit the webinar, quick 1-minute survey just to get your feedback on today's webinar and how we can improve going forward, as well as any suggestions on topics that we might be able to do. And so Greg, we have a couple of questions here. The first one is, do you see companies managing retention and disposal successfully in structured systems? And if so, how? Greg, are you on mute?
Sorry about that. Yes, I was. So I think we talked almost exclusively about unstructured data today, but from a structured perspective, many structured systems have record retention capabilities and modules, but in most companies, they have not been enabled in one way or another. This is an emerging area where a lot of people are starting to place some energy into for a couple of reasons. One, because the repositories themselves get too big and they're hard to manage and the performance starts to suffer. And the second is because a lot of people are moving data out of those primary structured repositories into places like data warehouses and data lakes for big data type information and running afoul of the amount of time that they can save certain information and change it. So yes, absolutely, there's a whole different set of strategy for structured data that follows in line with the same basic requirements and needs of a unstructured data strategy, but the repositories and the methodologies are much different.
Okay, and then our next question, this might be the final question. While this is a group approach with various departments involved, who is ultimately responsible for the roadmap? Is it one specific person, a department that needs to be held accountable?
So I think what a lot of companies are discovering is that if you try to manage this from separate areas with separate requirements and separate drivers, you're not going to be successful. This is truly a corporate activity. So one of the first things that should be in place before you attempt to do something like completely change your unstructured data landscape is to create a true information governance organization. That may be as simple as having an information governance officer that is, a C-level type executive in charge of this initiative, and to therefore have him have a group of individuals from each of the most engaged silos to work together as some kind of advisory board or steering committee, or as complex as having a 3-phase organization of a set of working groups, a set of steering committees or a steering committee, and then an advisory board, potentially with a leader and maybe not. So the answer is no one part of a company should ever try to take this on. This truly needs to be a corporate initiative. Now, it may be led out of the gate, out of legal, out of IT, out of records management, out of information security, but to be truly successful, it needs to be a corporate-wide initiative.
All right, and Greg, I think we have time for one final question here. What processes are needed to deduplicate both structured and unstructured data?
Well, okay, so deduplication to me is a very complex process because it depends on whether you're talking about deduplicating for one group in a single repository or deduplicating across an entire repository for the whole company, or deduping for multiple repositories for multiple groups. The reason duplicates exist in most cases is because you are not creating collaborative areas where multiple business units or departments work, but instead individual silos where each group works. So from a deduplication perspective, the answers are different for each repository, but frankly, putting together this type of data placement strategy and getting to a point where there is a single place of truth where everybody is working collaboratively will actually reduce quite a bit of those duplicates. So I think there is a different go-forward strategy for reducing duplicates than there is a legacy data strategy for reducing duplicates and getting rid of redundant information.
All right. Well, I think we are about time. Thank you so much for the information today, Greg. For all of you still on the line, make sure to email us if you want a copy of those white papers. And if you have any other questions around data placement, feel free to email us or give us a call and see if we can answer those questions. In the meantime, we will see you on December 13th. Make sure to mark your calendars. And otherwise, we wish you success as you implement data placement in your organization. Thank you.